Fourth set of objections. A letter to the distinguished gentleman. Dear Sir, it has not been your desire to bestow your blessings upon me without exacting a price. You demand repayment for a service most kind, and surely it is a heavy payment. You would have me become familiar with this absolutely brilliant work only on the condition that I make known my feelings about it. This is a harsh condition, compliance with which has been wrung from me by a craving to know things most fine, and I would be most delighted to protest against such a condition if, just as an exception is granted by the praetor, if an action has been performed under the influence of force or fear. I were able to obtain the following new exception, if an action has been performed under the influence of pleasure. What then is your wish? You do not await my judgment of the author, for you already know how highly I regard the supreme power of his intelligence and his singular erudition. Moreover, you are not unaware of how annoying the tasks are that take up my time, nor would it follow, were you to give me more credit than I deserve, that I am unaware of my own shortcomings. And yet what you present for examination requires both extraordinary intelligence and, above all, considerable serenity of mind in order for it to have the leisure to free itself from the clatter of all external things, which you know full well is impossible for the mind to accomplish without attentive meditation and deep contemplation upon itself. Still, if it is your wish, then I must obey. The fault for whatever mistake I make will lie with you, who are forcing me to write. Now, although philosophy could claim the whole of this work for its own, nevertheless, since this exceedingly modest gentleman voluntarily places himself before a tribunal of theologians, I play a dual role here. First, I propose the objections that in my opinion could be raised by philosophers regarding the major questions as to the nature of our mind and of God. Next, I indicate those things at which a theologian could take offense in the work as a whole. Concerning the nature of the human mind. The first thing that arises here for us to marvel at is that the distinguished gentleman established as the principle of the whole of his philosophy the same one as established by St. Augustine, a man of most penetrating intelligence, and greatly to be admired not only in theology but also in philosophy. For in On the Free Choice of the Will, Book 2, Chapter 3, Alypius, during his debate with Evodius, was about to prove the existence of God when he asserted, "First, to begin with things that are most evident, I asked you whether you yourself exist, or whether perhaps you are afraid you might be mistaken in this line of questioning, since, in any event, if you did not exist, you can never be mistaken." The words of our author are similar, but there is some deceiver or other who is supremely powerful, and supremely sly, who is always deliberately deceiving me. Then, too, there is no doubt that I exist, if he is deceiving me. But let us proceed, and, more to the point, let us see how one could conclude from this principle that our mind is separate from the body. I can doubt whether I have a body, or even whether there are any bodies in the world, and yet it is not proper for me to doubt whether I am or exist during the time I am doubting or thinking. Thus, I who am doubting and thinking am not a body. Otherwise, in entertaining doubts about my body, I would be entertaining doubts about myself. In fact, even if I were stubbornly to maintain that absolutely no bodies existed, nevertheless the thesis still stands. I am something, therefore I am not a body. This is a rather sharp bit of reasoning, but someone will raise the same objection that the author raises against himself. My doubting about a body or my denying that there is a body does not bring it about that no body exists, he says. Perhaps then it is the case that these very things which I take to be nothing, because they are unknown to me, nevertheless are in fact no different from that me that I know. This I do not know, and I will not quarrel about it. I know that I exist. I ask now, who is this I, whom I know? Most certainly, in the strict sense, the knowledge of this I does not depend upon things whose existence I do not yet know. But he admits that in the argument put forward in the discourse on method, the conclusion was deduced solely in order to exclude anything corporeal from the nature of the mind, and that this argument was put forward not according to the order of the truth of the matter, but only according to the order of his perception. Thus his point was that he knows utterly nothing that pertains to his essence except that he is a thinking thing. In saying this, it is obvious that his argument still remains mired in the same terms as before. And thus there remains the whole problem he promised to resolve. How does it follow from the fact that he knows nothing else to pertain to his essence, that nothing else really does pertain to it? Nevertheless, I admit my slow-wittedness and confess that I could not find this addressed anywhere in the second meditation. But my best guess is that he attempts to prove this in the sixth meditation, since he judged that this proof depends upon a clear knowledge of God, which he had not yet acquired for himself in the second meditation. Thus he proves this conclusion in the following way. Because I know that all the things that I clearly and distinctly understand can be made by God, such as I understand them, my ability clearly and distinctly to understand one thing without another suffices to make me certain that the one thing is different from the other, since they can be separated from each other, at least by God. The question as to the sort of power that might affect such a separation is not relevant to their being thought different. Thus, because on the one hand I have a clear and distinct idea of myself, insofar as I am merely a thinking thing and not an extended thing, and because on the other hand I have a distinct idea of a body, insofar as it is merely an extended thing and not a thinking thing, it is certain that I am really distinct from my body and I can exist without it. We must stop here for a short time, since the whole problem seems to me to hinge on these few words. And first of all, in order to be true, the major premise of the syllogism should be understood to refer not to just any sort of knowledge of a thing, clear and distinct though it may be, but only to knowledge that is adequate. For the distinguished gentleman admits in his reply to the theologian that for one thing to be conceived distinctly and separately from another by an act of abstraction on the part of the understanding inadequately conceiving the thing, a formal distinction is sufficient and a real distinction is not required. From this he concludes in the same passage, "But I completely understand what a body is when I think that it merely has extension and shape, is capable of moving, and so on. And I deny that there is anything whatsoever in it that belongs to the nature of the mind. Conversely, I understand that the mind is a complete thing that doubts, understands, wills, and so on, even though I deny that there is anything in it that is contained in the idea of a body. Therefore, there is a real distinction. But if someone calls this minor premise into question, arguing it is merely a matter of the inadequacy of your conception of yourself when you conceive yourself as a thinking thing and not as an extended thing, and likewise when you conceive yourself as an extended thing and not a thinking thing, we must see how it has been proved in the earlier phases of the argument. For I do not think this matter is so clear that it should be assumed to be an indemonstrable principle and something not to be proved. Indeed, as to the first part of the above statement, namely, that you completely understand what a body is in thinking that it is merely some thing having extension and shape, is capable of moving, and so on, and in denying that there is in it anything that belongs to the nature of the mind, this adds very little to the discussion. For a person who contends that our mind is corporeal does not on that account think that every body is a mind. Were we to follow that line of reasoning, body would be related to mind the way genus is related to species, but a genus can be understood without a species, even if we were to deny to the genus all that is proper and peculiar to the species. Whence the logician's commonplace, the negation of the species does not negate the genus. Thus I can understand a figure without my understanding any of the attributes that are proper to a circle. Therefore, it remains to be proved that the mind can be completely and adequately understood without the body. I see no other argument in the entire work that is suitable for proving this, except what was put forward at the very beginning. I can deny that there is any body or any extended thing, and yet I am certain I exist during the time I am denying this or am thinking. Therefore, I am a thinking thing, not a body, and the body does not have a bearing on the knowledge I have of myself. But so far as I can see, the only thing resulting from this is that some knowledge of myself can be obtained without the knowledge of the body, but it is not yet plainly evident to me that this knowledge is complete and adequate, such that I would be certain I am not mistaken when I exclude body from my essence. I shall use an example to make my point. Suppose that someone knows with certainty that an angle inscribed in a semicircle is a right angle, and thus that this triangle formed from that angle and the diameter of the circle is right angled. Nevertheless, he may doubt and may not yet have grasped this fact with certainty. In fact, deluded by some fallacy, he denies that the square of the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares of the sides. He will seem to have corroboration of his false belief by the very same line of reasoning advanced by the distinguished gentleman. For while perceiving clearly and distinctly that the triangle is right-angled, I still am in doubt whether the square of its hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares of its sides. Therefore, he says, it does not belong to the essence of the triangle that the square of its hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares of its sides. Moreover, even if I were to deny that the square of its hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares of its sides, still I continue to be certain that the triangle is right-angled, and the clear and distinct knowledge remains in my mind that one of its angles is a right angle. This being the case, not even God could cause this triangle not to be right-angled. Therefore, a property about which I am in doubt or whose removal leaves me with the same idea of a thing does not belong to the essence of that thing. Moreover, because I know that all the things that I clearly and distinctly understand can be made by God, such as I understand them, my ability clearly and distinctly to understand one thing without another suffices to make me certain that the one thing is different from the other, since they can be separated from each other, at least by God. But I clearly and distinctly understand this triangle to be right-angled, without my understanding the square of its hypotenuse to be equal to the sum of the squares of its sides. Therefore, God, at least, can bring about a right triangle the square of whose hypotenuse is not equal to the sum of the squares of its sides. I do not see what reply could be made here, except that the man in the example does not clearly and distinctly perceive a right triangle. But what is the basis for my claim that I perceive the nature of my mind more clearly than does the person in the example who perceives the nature of a triangle? For he is just as certain that a triangle inscribed in a semicircle has one right angle, which is what betokens a right triangle, as I am that from the fact that I think it follows that I exist. Thus, while the person in the example clearly and distinctly knows the triangle to be right-angled, he is mistaken in judging that it does not belong to the nature of this triangle, that the square of its hypotenuse is equal, and so on. Just so, why am I not perhaps mistaken in judging that nothing else pertains to my nature, which I clearly and distinctly know to be a thinking thing, except that I am a thinking thing, since perhaps it also belongs to my nature that I am an extended thing? And certainly someone will declare that there is no cause for wonder if, when I conclude that I exist from the fact that I am thinking, the idea that I form of myself, thus known, represents to my soul nothing but myself as a thinking thing, which surely has been derived from my thought alone. As a result, it seems there can be derived from this idea no argument to the effect that nothing more pertains to my essence than what is contained in the idea. Moreover, this argument appears to prove too much and leads us to the Platonic teaching, which nevertheless the author disproves, that nothing corporeal belongs to our essence, so that man is nothing but a soul, while a body is merely the vehicle for the soul, hence the definition of man as a soul using a body. But if you answer that the body is not unconditionally excluded from my essence, but only insofar as I am precisely a thinking thing. It seems there is good reason for fear lest someone entertain the suspicion that perhaps the knowledge of myself, insofar as I am a thinking thing, is not the knowledge of something completely and adequately conceived, but only inadequately and with a certain abstraction on the part of the understanding. Thus, geometricians conceive of a line as a length without width, and a surface as length and width together without depth. Even though length does not exist without width, nor width without depth. In like manner, someone could perhaps be in doubt whether every thinking thing is also an extended thing, in which nevertheless, in addition to the properties it has in common with other extended things, such as the capacity to take on various shapes, to move, and so on, there inheres a power of thinking peculiar to it. Whence it follows that although it could, by an abstraction on the part of the understanding, be taken for a thinking thing by virtue of this power alone, corporal properties may really belong to a thinking thing. In like manner, even though quantity can be conceived in terms of length alone, in actual fact, width and depth together belong to every quantity along with length. The difficulty is increased by the fact that this power of thinking appears to be attached to corporal organs, since one could judge it to be dormant in infants and extinguished in the insane. And this is what unbelievers who have the soul's blood on their teeth most strongly urge. Up to this point, I have been considering the real distinction between our soul and the body. But since the distinguished gentleman undertook to demonstrate the immortality of the soul, it might be appropriate to ask whether immortality manifestly follows from this separation. For according to the principles of traditional philosophy, this does not follow at all, since philosophers have traditionally regarded the souls of brute animals to be distinct from their bodies, and yet these souls still perished with their bodies. I had progressed this far in my reply and had intended to show how, according to our author's own principles, which I seem to have gathered from his method of philosophizing, the immortality also offers the very same solution I was about to offer regarding the problem before us. But as to the souls of brute animals, he hints in enough other passages that they have no soul. All they have is a body arranged in a certain manner, and so composed of various organs that all the operations that we observe could take place in and through it. But I fear it is possible this position might not gain acceptance in the minds of men if it is not bolstered by the strongest arguments. For on first blush it appears incredible how it could happen. Without the intervention of any soul, that light reflected from the body of a wolf unto the eyes of a sheep could move the extremely thin fibers of the optic nerves, and that, as a result of this motion penetrating into the brain, animal spirits are diffused into the nerves in just the way required to cause the sheep to take flight. At this juncture, I will make one additional point, namely, that I thoroughly approve of what the distinguished gentleman teaches regarding the distinction between imagination and thought, or understanding, and regarding the greater certainty of those things we grasp by means of reason as opposed to the things we observe by means of the corporal senses. For a long time ago, I learned from St. Augustine in his On the Greatness of the Soul, chapter 15, that we must keep our distance from those who are convinced that what we discern through our understanding is less certain than what presents itself to the corporal eyes, bothered as they always are with phlegm. Whence he also declares in his Soliloquies, Book 1, Chapter 4, that in matters pertaining to geometry he found the senses to be like a boat. For when, he says, they had brought me to the place I was bound for, I there took my leave of them, and once located on solid ground, I began to review these things in my thought, and for a time my gait was unsteady. Thus it seemed to me a person could more quickly navigate on land than he could perceive geometry by means of the senses, even though the senses do seem to be of some help when we are first learning geometry. Concerning God. The first proof of the existence of God, the one the author spells out in the third meditation, has two parts. The first part is that God exists if indeed there is an idea of God in me. The second part is that I who have such an idea could be derived only from God. Regarding the first part, there is one thing that is not proved to me, namely, that when the distinguished gentleman asserted that falsity properly so called can be found only in judgments, he nevertheless admits a bit later that ideas can be false, not formally false, mind you, but materially false. This seems to me to be out of keeping with his first principles, but I fear I should not be able to explain with enough lucidity. My feelings on a matter that is decidedly obscure. An example will make it clearer. The author asserts that if cold is but the privation of heat, the idea of cold that represents it to me as if it were something positive will be materially false. Moreover, if cold is merely a privation, then there cannot be an idea of cold that represents it to me as something positive. And here the author confuses a judgment with an idea. For what is the idea of cold? Coldness itself, insofar as it exists objectively in the understanding. But if cold is a privation, it cannot exist objectively in the understanding by means of an idea whose objective existence is a positive being. Thus, if cold is but a privation, there cannot be a positive idea of it, and hence there could never be an idea that is materially false. This is confirmed by the same argument that the distinguished gentleman uses to prove that the idea of an infinite cannot but be true. For although one could imagine that such a being does not exist, nevertheless one could not imagine that the idea of such a being presented nothing real to me. We can readily say the same thing about every positive idea. For although one could imagine that cold, which I think is represented by a positive idea, is not something positive, still one cannot imagine that the positive idea presents to me nothing real and positive. This is because an idea is not said to be positive in virtue of the existence it has as a mode of thinking. For on that score all ideas would be positive, but rather in virtue of the objective existence it contains and that it presents to our mind. Therefore, though it is possible that this idea is not the idea of cold, it nevertheless cannot be a false one. But you may say it is false precisely in virtue of its not being the idea of cold. Actually, it is your judgment that is false. Were you to judge it to be the idea of cold, but the idea in and of itself is most true. In like manner, the idea of God surely ought not be called false, not even materially, even though someone could transfer it to something that is not God, as idolaters have done. Finally, what does this idea of cold, which you say is materially false, display to your mind? A privation? Then it is true. A positive being? Then it is not the cold of then it is not the idea of cold. Again, what is the cause of this positive objective being, which, in your opinion, renders this idea materially false? It is I, you say, insofar as I am derived from nothing. Therefore, the positive objective existence of some idea can be derived from nothing, a conclusion that destroys the principal foundations of the distinguished gentleman. But let us move on to the second part of the demonstration, where he asks whether I myself, who have the idea of an infinite being, could be derived from something other than an infinite being, and especially whether I am derived from myself. The distinguished gentleman contends that I could not be derived from myself, in view of the fact that, were I myself to give myself existence, I would also give myself all the perfections and idea of which I observe to be within me. But the theologian replies with the astute observation that, being derived from itself, esse a se, ought to be taken not in a positive sense, but in a negative sense, to the effect that it means the same thing as not derived from another. But, he says, if something is derived from itself, that is to say, not from something else, how do I prove that this thing encompasses all things and that it is infinite? I do not follow you now if you say, if it is derived from itself, it would have easily given itself all things. For neither is it derived from itself as from a cause, nor did it exist prior to itself, such that it would choose beforehand what it would later be. To refute this argument, the distinguished gentleman maintains that being derived from itself ought to be taken in a positive rather than a negative sense, even when it applies to God, to the effect that God stands in the same relationship to himself as an efficient cause does to its effect. This seems to me to be a harsh statement, and a false one at that. Thus, while I am partly in agreement with the distinguished gentleman, I am partly in disagreement with him, for I confess I cannot be derived from myself except in a positive fashion, but I deny that the same way may be said of God. In fact, I think it a manifest contradiction that something is derived from itself positively and, as it were, from a cause. Thus, I bring about the same result as our author, but by way of quite another route, and it goes as follows. For me to be derived from myself, I ought to be derived from myself in a positive fashion, and, as it were, from a cause. Therefore, it is impossible for me to be derived from myself. The major premise of the syllogism is proved by the gentleman's arguments that are drawn from the doctrine that, since the various parts of time can be separated from one another, the fact that I exist now does not entail my existing in the future, unless some cause, as it were, makes me over again at each individual moment. As to the minor premise, I believe it to be so clear by the light of nature that it is largely a waste of time to try to prove it. A matter of proving the known by means of the less known. Moreover, the author seems to have recognized the truth of this, since he has not made bold to disavow it publicly. Please weigh the following statement made in reply to the theologian. I do not say that it is impossible for something to be the efficient cause of itself, for although this is obviously the case when the meaning of efficient cause is restricted to those causes that are temporally prior to their effects, or are different from them, still it does not seem that such a restriction is appropriate in this inquiry, since the light of nature does not stipulate that the nature of an efficient cause requires that it be temporally prior to its effect. Well done, as far as the first part is concerned, but why has he left out the second part? And why has he not added that the very same light of nature does not stipulate that the essence, ratio, of an efficient cause requires that it be different from its effect, unless it is because the very same light of nature does not permit him to assert it? And since every effect depends upon a cause, and thus receives its existence from a cause, is it not patently clear that the same thing cannot depend on itself or receive its existence from itself? Moreover, every cause is the cause of an effect, and every effect the effect of a cause. Thus there is a reciprocal relationship between cause and effect. But a relationship must occur between two things. Moreover, it is absurd to conceive of something receiving existence and yet having existence prior to the time we conceive it to have received existence. But this would be the case were we to ascribe the notions of cause and effect to the very same thing in respect to itself. For what is the notion of a cause? Sorry. It is the giving of existence. And what is the notion of an effect? It is the receiving of existence. But the notion of a cause is prior by nature to that of an effect. But we cannot conceive of something as a cause, sub ratione causei, as something giving existence, unless we conceive of it as having existence. For no one gives what one does not have. Therefore, we would first be conceiving a thing as having existence before conceiving of it as having received it. And yet, in the case of whatever receives existence, receiving existence comes before having existence. This argument can be put differently. No one gives what he does not have. Therefore, no one can give himself existence unless he already has it. But if he already has it, why would he give it to himself? Finally, he claims that it is manifest by the light of nature that creation differs from preservation solely by virtue of a distinction of reason. But it is manifest by the very same light of nature that nothing can create itself. Therefore, nothing can preserve itself. But if we descend from the general thesis to the specific instance of God, the matter will, in my judgment, be even more manifest. God cannot be derived from itself positively, but only negatively, that is, in the sense of not being derived from something else. And first, it is manifest from the argument put forward by the distinguished gentleman to prove that if a body is derived from itself, then it ought to be derived from itself in a positive fashion. For, as he says, the parts of time do not depend one on another. Thus, the fact that this body is presumed up until the present time to have been derived from itself, that is, it has no cause, does not suffice to make it exist in the future, unless there is some power in it that, as it were, continuously remakes it. But so far from this argument being relevant to the case of a supremely perfect or infinite being, the opposite could far rather be readily deduced, and for opposite reasons. For contained in the idea of an infinite being is the fact that its duration is also infinite, that is, it is bounded by no limits, and thus it is indivisible, permanent, and possessed of all things all at once. Temporal sequence cannot be conceived to be in this idea except erroneously and through the imperfection of our understanding. Whence it manifestly follows that an infinite being cannot be conceived of as existing even for a moment without at the same time being conceived of as always having existed and as existing in the future for eternity, which is what the author himself teaches in another passage. Hence it is pointless to ask why it would continue to exist. Further, as is frequently taught by St. Augustine, than whom no one after the time of the sacred authors has ever spoken more nobly and sublimely about God. In God there is no past or future, but an eternal present. And from this it appears quite evident that it is only with absurdity that one can ask why God continues to exist, since this question obviously involves a temporal sequence of before and after, of past and future, and this ought to be excluded from the notion of an infinite being. Moreover, God cannot be thought of as being derived from itself positively, as if he had initially produced himself, for in that case he would have existed before he existed. Rather, God can be thought to be derived from himself solely in virtue of the fact that he really does preserve himself, as the author frequently states. But preservation is no more consonant with an infinite being than is an initial production. For what, pray, is preservation except a certain continuous remaking of something? Thus every instance of preservation presupposes an initial production, and for this reason the term continuation, like the term preservation, implies a certain potentiality, but an infinite being is the purest actuality, without any potentiality. Let us conclude then that God can be conceived to be derived from himself in a positive fashion only by reason of the imperfection of our understanding, which conceives of God after the manner of created things. This will be established even more firmly by means of another argument. The efficient cause of something is sought only with respect to a thing's existence, not its essence. For example, on seeing a triangle, I may seek the efficient cause that brought about the existence of this triangle, but it would be absurd for me to seek the efficient cause of the fact that the triangle has 3 angles equal to 2 right angles. Saying that an efficient cause is the reason for this is not a proper answer to someone making an inquiry. All that can be said is that it is simply the nature of a triangle to have such a property. Thus it is that mathematicians do not demonstrate by way of efficient or final causes, since they do not concern themselves with the existence of their object. But it no less belongs to the essence of an infinite being that it exists, and even, if you will, that it continues in existence, then it is of the essence of a triangle that it have 3 angles equal to 2 right angles. Therefore, just as one cannot give an answer by way of efficient causality to the person asking why a triangle has 3 angles equal to 2 right angles, but must say only that such is the eternal and unchangeable nature of a triangle. Just so, to the person asking why God exists or why God continues to exist, the advice should be given that no efficient cause, either inside or outside God, no quasi-efficient cause, for I am in disagreement about things, not words, is to be sought. Rather, this alone should be claimed as the reason, that such is the nature of a supremely perfect being. The distinguished gentleman states that the light of nature dictates that there exists nothing about which it is inappropriate to ask why it exists, or to or to inquire into its efficient cause, or, if it has none, to demand to know why it does not need one. Against this, my answer to the person asking why God exists is that one should not reply in terms of an efficient cause. Rather, one should say merely that it is because he is God, that is, an infinite being. And if someone were to ask for the efficient cause of God, we should answer that God needs no efficient cause. And were the inquirer once again to ask why God does not need an efficient cause, we should answer that it is because he is an infinite being, whose existence is his essence. For the only things that need an efficient cause are those in which it is appropriate to distinguish their actual existence from their essence. Thus is overthrown all that the author adds just after the passage is cited. Thus, he says, if I thought that nothing could in any way be related to itself the way in an efficient cause is related to its effect, it is out of the question that I then conclude that something is the first cause. On the contrary, I would again ask for the cause of that which was being called the first cause, and thus I would never arrive at any first cause of all things. On the contrary, were I to think we should seek the efficient or quasi-efficient cause of any given thing, I would seek a cause of each individual thing that was different from that thing, since it is most evident to me that in no way can something be in the same relation to itself as an efficient cause is to its effect. The author, in my opinion, should be put on notice so that he can consider these things attentively and diligently, since I certainly know there is hardly a theologian who would not take exception to the statement that God is derived from himself in a positive fashion, and, as it were, from a cause. My only remaining concern is whether the author does not commit a vicious circle when he says that we have no other basis on which to establish that what we clearly and distinctly perceive is true, than that God exists. But we can be certain that God exists only because we clearly and evidently perceive this fact. Therefore, before we are certain that God exists, we ought to be certain that whatever we clearly and evidently perceive is true. I add something that had escaped me. What the distinguished gentleman affirms as certain seems to me to be false, namely that there can be nothing in him, insofar as he is a thinking thing of which he is unaware. For this, him, insofar as it is a thinking thing, he understands to be merely his mind, insofar as it is distinct from his body. But who does not realize that there can be a great many things in the mind of which the mind is unaware? The mind of an infant in its mother's womb has the power to think, but it is not aware of it. I pass over countless examples similar to this one. Concerning matters that can attract the attention of theologians. To put an end to a discussion that has at times become tedious, it is preferable here to aim for brevity and merely show what these matters are rather than debate them in greater detail. First, I fear that some people may take offense at this rather wide open style of philosophizing, in which everything is called into doubt, and surely the author himself admits in his discourse on method that this style is dangerous to people of ordinary intelligence. Still, I confess that this concern is lessened in the synopsis. All the same, this meditation ought to be bolstered with a brief preface in which the author indicates that these things are not being seriously doubted at all. Rather, the purpose of doubting is to set aside for a short time whatever provides the least, or as the author says elsewhere, hyperbolic occasion for doubting whether something so firm and stable might be found that not even the most perverse person should have even the slightest grounds for doubting it. Thus, in place of the words, "Since I was ignorant of the author of my origin," I would advise replacing them with, "I pretended to be ignorant." In the fourth meditation, concerning the true and the false, I would urgently entreat the author, for reasons too numerous to list, to indicate two things either in this meditation or in the synopsis. The first is that when he inquires into the cause of error, he exhaustively treats the kind of error committed in sorting out truth and falsity, but not the kind of error that occurs in the pursuit of good and evil. For the former kind of error suffices for the author's plan and purpose, and the remarks made here regarding the cause of error may give rise to the gravest objections, were these remarks to be extended to apply to the domain of the latter kind of error. Thus, unless I am mistaken, prudence and the order to be used in teaching, about which our author is most zealous, demand that whatever is not relevant and can provide an opportunity for a squabbling should be left out. Otherwise, the reader may be hampered in perceiving what is important by being drawn into senseless brawls regarding things that are non-essential. The second thing that I would like to point out to our author is that in asserting that we should not give our assent to anything unless we know it clearly and distinctly, he is dealing only with things that pertain to the academic disciplines and that fall within the grasp of human understanding. He is not, however, dealing with matters of faith and the conduct of life. This is why he condemns the rashness of the opinionated, but not the conviction of prudent believers. For, as St. Augustine wisely reminds us in his On the Usefulness of Believing, chapter 15, in the souls of men there are three activities that seem similar to one another and most suitable for being distinguished from one another: understanding, believing, and being opinionated. A person understands something if he grasps it by means of a sure argument. A person believes something if, having been influenced by some weighty authority, he thinks it to be true, even though he does not grasp it by means of a sure argument. And a person is opinionated who thinks he knows something which he does not know. But being opinionated is the most detestable of all, and for two reasons. First, if a person is convinced he already knows something, he cannot learn it about if in fact there is something to be learned. And second, the rashness itself is a sign of an ill-tempered soul. Thus, what we know we owe to reason, what we believe we owe to authority, what we are opinionated about we owe to error. These things have been said so that we might understand that, when holding fast to our faith, even in those things we do not yet grasp, we are innocent of the rashness of the opinionated. For those who claim that we should believe only what we know are on their guard only against the accusation of being opinionated, a trait that is admittedly base and wretched. But were one to consider carefully that there is a great deal of difference between someone who thinks he knows something and someone who understands that he does not know something and yet believes it on the strength of some authority, then he will indeed avoid the charge of error, poor breeding, and arrogance. And a bit later in chapter 12, St. Augustine adds, "A great many arguments can be brought forward to show that absolutely nothing in human society would remain safe were we to have set down as a precept that we should believe only what we grasp with full discernment. Thus far to this point we have the teachings of St. Augustine." The distinguished gentleman will easily judge for himself, and in accord with his own sense of prudence, how important it is to draw the above distinction, lest the many who in these times are prone to impiety might be able to abuse his words in order to overturn the faith. But what I foresee will be most especially offensive to theologians is that according to the teachings of the distinguished gentleman, the dogmas taught by the Church regarding the most holy mysteries of the altar seem incapable of remaining whole and intact. For we believe on faith that once the substance of the bread has been removed from the Eucharistic bread, only the accidents remain there. These latter are extension, shape, color, odor, taste, and the other sensible qualities. The distinguished gentleman believes there are no sensible qualities, but merely the various motions of the small bodies that surround us. by means of which we perceive the various impressions, which we in turn call by the names color, taste, and odor. Thus there remain shape, extension, and the ability to move about. But the author denies that these features can be understood without the substance in which they inhere. Moreover, he holds that they cannot exist without it, a point he also repeats in his reply to the theologian. And he acknowledges only a formal distinction between these affections and substance. But this sort of distinction seems insufficient for distinguishing those affections that are also separated from one another by divine intervention. I have no doubt but that the distinguished gentleman's piety is such that he will carefully and attentively ponder this, and will judge that he must apply himself with the greatest of zeal, lest, when he meditates upon championing the cause of God against the impious, he appear to have somehow created a danger to the very faith established by God's authority, by whose grace the gentleman hopes to win that eternal life, about which he has undertaken to convince mankind.